You can fly to Israel right now and visit the historic Pools of Solomon. They're just about 2 miles outside of Bethlehem. They are an amazing feat of civic engineering from the ancient world. With a capacity of more than 75 million gallons, they fed the aqueducts supplying Jerusalem with water, off and on for more than 2,000 years. Way into the modern era. Like, you think, really, they were still using that. Now, some argue that these pools are not the ones discussed in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. That's fine. Josephus says they were, in fact, built by Solomon. The question is, why did he build them? Naturally, Jerusalem needed water. On top of that, tradition states that it was a place where Solomon's many wives would bathe and that the king would pass by the spot while riding in his chariot. But the real reason why he built these pools is in our text tonight. He built it for himself. He'll tell us so. He hoped that this project and many others like it would give him some sort of lasting satisfaction. It was one more desperate attempt to discover meaning in his life, a reason for living. Tonight we'll see the many avenues he started taking in his pursuit for meaning, and we'll see that he lived what we would call the good life. I mean, the very best life. And he lived the good life to an extreme that none of us, probably all of us put together, we could never approximate how far into the good life he went. But no matter how much he had, how far he went, how good it felt, it was never enough. Day after day, he woke up still empty, still unfulfilled, still wondering what's it all about. So let's look at verse 1. And Solomon talking, but remember he's the teacher who's giving us a lecture in the book of Ecclesiastes. And here's what he says in verse 1. I said to myself, go ahead, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. At the start of his experiments, the teacher tries a variety of personal pleasures, and personal is the operative word tonight. Everything we'll read in this text was for self, very specifically, completely self-oriented. He's going to use the word I 21 times in 11 verses, not to mention the me's, myself's, and my's. I mean, it's all about him. What is the chapter open with? I said to myself. That's the opening phrase here. And what he decided in this avenue of experimentation was to live what we might call a purely hedonistic lifestyle. A lifestyle dedicated to human pleasure, human pursuit, human fulfillment, self-indulgence, self-fulfillment, unrestrained luxury and experience. All the promises that are made to you on casino billboards, in brochures for cruise vacations, on every piece of junk mail that has the words "one lucky winner," all of those promises and everything else that you could see out there in the advertising world, all of those things the teacher did for himself. All of them. And he did it without even having to go into debt or lose his house or anything like that. Anything his heart desired, any experience, any item, any pursuit, he went whole hog. If you're a fan of the original Jurassic Park, what does John Hammond say over and over again about his island park, that his special project? Spared no expense. How did it turn out for him? Now, the pleasure pursuits that he's going to talk about tonight, they weren't all necessarily bad or sinful. I mean, I think sometimes as more conservative Christians, we hear the word pleasure and we immediately think, well, that's a bad thing, right? It kind of comes out of our sort of puritanical tradition in America. But what he's talking about isn't all whole hog necessarily sinful. The term he uses here can simply mean joy or gladness. And we'll see that he strays into other things that he shouldn't, from a moralistic standpoint. But he was just trying to fulfill himself with experience, with pleasure. And we'll see that all of his efforts were physical, temporal, personal. They were all under the sun. Remember, that's all of his study, all of his scope, the teacher. It's all about, can I live life under the sun on this earthly plane in a way that has real lasting value, in a way that can overcome the problems of time, death, and chance that plague us here in this world. Now, as usual, he gives us the bottom line up front. It all turned out to be hevel, smoke. He was surprised to find out that a life of pleasure was hevel. In fact, it says there, where my version says but it turned out to be hevel, the word there is actually behold. Take a look at this. He's inviting us into his surprise. He didn't expect this outcome. We don't expect that outcome either, right? We don't expect a life with total, wealth and any experience that you want, and your whole life is just writing, check after check, and all of them, none of them bounce. We would never expect that it would turn out badly for us. In fact, we still have a hard time believing that truth today, no matter how many times we're told that it's true. We think that maybe we know how to beat the system. Yes, we look at these people, famous people, wealthy people, historic people, people without the Lord, and we see how often their lives end in misery, how often their lives end in broken relationships, how often their lives end in suicide. And we have this inclination, we think, well, yeah, they had fame, they had notoriety, they had wealth, they had prominence, they had position, they had all these things, but we could figure it out. We could beat the system. We could really, know what to do so that we could sort of have all the things the teacher's going for in chapter 2 here, but also have the Christian faith along with it. But we can't beat the system. Verse 2 says, I said about laughter, it's madness. And about pleasure, what does this accomplish? They say laughter is the best medicine, but better keep taking your insulin just to be sure, right? It's not that the teacher is against laughter. Laughter and whimsy are great things. But the question is, and the problem that he's trying to solve is, does it have the kind of value that really matters for the basic problems of life? Can you feed your family with laughs? You can love a good joke, but imagine you went to see your favorite comedian, and they get up and they start their show and they tell their great bit, and everybody cracks up, a roar of laughter, throughout the crowd. But then the audience becomes quiet again, and then the comedian proceeds to tell the exact same joke that they just told, in the exact same way. No one's going to laugh a second time. We'd all just be confused. Why is that? Because there needs to be a new joke. The old joke is gone. That laugh is over. The first is gone. We need another one to follow it up. Now, man's humor can really help in day-to-day circumstances. We love to laugh, but it cannot solve the basic problems of life. It improves experience, but it doesn't give meaning to existence. Verse 3, I explored with my mind the pull of wine on my body, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, and how to grasp folly, until I could see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So the teacher left the laugh factory feeling more crazy than contented. So he ditched comedy and he gave chemicals a try. And he became a great expert on wine. Later we'll see he didn't just imbibe, he founded great wineries too. He had the best vintage around. Now, he wasn't blacking out drunk every night. This is important. We see the caveat. He says, hey, my mind was still guiding me with wisdom, but he was experimenting with intoxication, with different states of mind through what we would call chemical agents. He was doing it purposefully, but he was doing it regularly. Maybe you've heard of 2021's Best International Picture from the Oscars. It was called Another Round. I believe it came out of Denmark. But the movie is about 4 friends who embark on an experiment where they would maintain a certain blood alcohol level throughout the workday. Just round the clock have a certain level of intoxication. And that, the movie, are you guys going to watch a Danish movie later tonight? I'm going to spoil it for you. So the movie ends predictably in tragedy, right? One of the friends ends up dying, drowning. And how does the movie close? Well, the other 3 surviving friends, console each other by going and having a drink. And I'm like, what? Man, if that's not Ecclesiastes, I don't know what it is. That movie sounds silly until you learn that there actually have been lab experiments where they run scientific studies on constant microdosing of alcohol around the clock. Now, an article I read on this sort of suggested a few positive effects of this. And then they said, although you're going to have to watch out for addiction, cancers, digestive diseases, and other health and social harms to both the drinker and others. But they say, but you'll be more sociable. Oh, okay. In the cancer ward, like I'll be more sociable. But anyway, the teacher asks here, it's an important thing. It doesn't have to just do with the wine. It has to do with his mindset and what he's looking for. He asks there in verse 3, is it good? Is this good? The things that I'm doing, not just wine, but all of these pursuits tonight, will this do for me what I want it to in the long run? Is this going to solve the aching emptiness in my heart? And we references there the brevity of life and the fact that all of us are headed toward death. We talked about this in our first study, that it is sure that all of us are headed toward death as human beings. We're mortal. We don't know if that's a day from now or 100 days from now or thousands of days from now, but we're headed towards death. And so is this good? Is this way of life going to solve that problem? He's trying to grasp an answer, we see there. But as he tries to grasp it, the hevel drifts away with his buzz. And he wakes up again, hungover the next morning, realizing that this is not a meaningful way for me to live my life. Comedy and chemicals weren't the solve he longed for, and so he next turned to great civic endeavors. Verse 4, I increased my achievements. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted every kind of fruit tree in them. I constructed reservoirs for myself from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. Notice that everything here is in the plural, everything. When the teacher built, he built a lot. And he built big palaces, storehouses, fortresses, halls, chariot cities, orchards and gardens and reservoirs with which to water them. But it's important to see here, it wasn't for his people. It wasn't because, well, I'm a king and I need to take care of my people. Not primarily, at least. He says right up front in verse 4, he says, I built and planted for myself. And as you scan the rest of the verses, you're going to see that he uses that phrase 5 times in these remaining verses. For myself. It was for me. It was because it was my idea to solve the emptiness within. Could I grab for myself meaning? Could I grab for myself fulfillment and satisfaction and contentment and purpose? I'll try this. I'll try that. I'll try another thing. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll spare no expense because I need to find this answer. Now, this is interesting, at least I thought so. The word he uses for parks here is the word from which the Greeks got their word for paradise. And so we can see what he's doing, building a fruitful garden paradise with every comfort and fortification possible, right? He's trying to solve his spiritual angst by constructing a perfect earthly society. He wants to get back to Eden. Only this time he's going to fortify it so no one can come in and ruin it. But it wasn't ruined from the outside, was it? It was ruined from the inside. It was ruined by the inhabitants of Eden because they had a heart problem. So he wants to get back. He wants to find himself in a world that is before it was ruined by sin, hounded by death, full of thorns and briars and suffering and all these things. Can we get back there? I'll build it for myself. I'll create it for myself. I'll construct everything I need to get myself into that place. And hopefully there I'll find what I'm looking for. And you know what? The problem is he wants to jump back into Genesis 2 without doing anything about Genesis 3. He doesn't want to deal with the fact that, no, you're the problem, teacher. Your heart is the problem. It's not your circumstances. It's not the society you're in. It's not the trappings around you. It's Genesis 3 that is the problem. There's nothing the teacher can build or design or construct or fortify that fixes the problem of sin. He wants Eden. He wants the perfect, harmonious creation, but he refuses to deal with the problem of the heart. All of his experiments, all of his efforts, all of his focus are on the things under the sun. Elements he can control, temporal things he can build, lay hold of, accumulate for himself. And so he wants to build his way out of sin. Why? Because the teacher has decided that in his mindset is, I'm God. He believes that there's a God, right? We talked about this in the opening passages of Ecclesiastes. The teacher is speaking to us as someone who wants to live as if God doesn't matter, as if God isn't personal. Yeah, there is a God, and the teacher will talk about God. He's not an atheist, but God doesn't matter. I live life for me. I'm in charge of my destiny. And so we see here, therefore, he's realized, okay, well, I'm God then. I will do whatever I need to do to create Eden for myself. I will make my own kingdom, and maybe that will be enough. That's what we're seeing here in chapter 2. And the truth is, his efforts yielded a lot of earthly success. The groves were flourishing. There was all kinds of fruit. The palaces were sparkling. The chariot cities made the other nations tremble in fear. But the teacher's utopia wouldn't last, of course. In fact, if we're connecting this to Solomon, the whole society fell apart immediately after he died. But even for his own heart, it wasn't going to last. It's just another failed attempt by mankind to create an ideal society without God. It's a long and sorry list. Have you ever looked up the list of attempted utopias? I mean, there are tons of them. Brook Farm, Soul City, Drop City, Silkville, Fordlandia. That one's my favorite. How about Jonestown? We all think of Jonestown as a crazy cult, but it was actually meant to be a utopian society that, where everybody's going to be equal and we are going to have none of these, we're not going to have any kind of hostility or tension. And what happens? They're all dead. Destroyed by sin, destroyed by the whims of a maniac who said he was bringing heaven on earth, right? It's a sad list. Right now, tech billionaires are moving forward with their plan for a new utopian city between San Francisco and Sacramento. Have you heard about this? We smile and snicker at this, but they are doing this. It's one that they say will be affordable and sustainable and walkable, of course. They say it will open up a new path for the state of California. The leader of the effort says, I'm going to make this happen no matter what. That is his quote. They're calling it California Forever. Who's heard of California Forever? Anybody? Oh man, find out about it. You know what? They have already spent $800 million buying up land. It's happening. They're buying up all of this acreage and all of this farmland and all this stuff. They've spent almost $1 billion real dollars in this effort. And this plan, we're going to build a utopian society, they say. Don't drink the Kool-Aid if you go there, But Solomon's utopia was greater than any of these other attempts, by far. And the physical results were impressive. Extreme wealth for a time, great production, impressive development. But you know what we see again and again in the book of Ecclesiastes? Under the sun, hevel always wins. The more he built, the more he needed to build it. You plant a grove, well, now you need a reservoir to water the trees. The pools of Solomon, by the way, are still surrounded by a grove of pine trees today if you were to visit them. Where would he get all the labor he needed for this garden paradise, for this new utopia? Verse 7, I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I also owned livestock, large herds and flocks, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Apparently, people weren't lining up to volunteer for the teacher's building projects. Instead, he had to enslave countless thousands of people. It was his dream, not theirs, right? He wasn't building it for them. He was building it for himself. And so he enslaved people to do it. He controlled their lives. Now, as far as slave owners go, Solomon was a better one than some others have had. But he controlled their lives from the moment they were born in some cases till the moment they died. Utopia was populated with slaves. But where there are slaves, there are hungry bellies. And so now the teacher needed flocks and herds to maintain the workforce. Of course, the more cattle he had, the more people he needed to manage the cattle. From the human perspective, this all looked like greatness and power, but in reality, we see that it is this never-ending cycle that can't be satisfied. It's hevel. As soon as you build a city, the city needs to be maintained. Roads start to go into disrepair. Aqueducts start to leak. All of these different problems. Solomon had a huge number of servants, slaves, and livestock. As a couple examples, at the dedication of the temple by itself in Jerusalem, it's recorded that he sacrificed 22,000 cattle that day and 120,000 sheep and goats. At one point, the Old Testament tells us how much food the court of Solomon ate every day. And looking at the menu, there would have been thousands of workers and servants in the lunch line. An astonishing, productive society. The point here is that the teacher did work on a scale unlike anything we've ever known. But it still wasn't enough. His heart still ached. As I said, as soon as the buildings went up, they started to break down, and they would need repair, and they would need, redesigning, and they would need reevaluation. His pools were magnificent, but even they don't last. They lasted a long time, but they're completely obsolete now. Think about that. Think about the feat and the work and the effort that it was for Solomon to construct these pools, and now we're like, we have PVC now. We don't need your dumb pools, right? They're completely obsolete. And worse than obsolete, since 1993, at least 6 people have drowned in the pools. That's a great picture of hevel, right? All of this effort that Solomon went to supply water for Jerusalem has now eventuated in the death of people. And that's what's going on. It's hevel. Because our best efforts under the sun are always plagued by time, death, and chance. Verse 8 begins this way: I also amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces. How do you get the treasure of kings? Well, either through war or the threat of war. Kings don't typically want to part with their treasures, do they? But there they are in his palace storehouses. So we've gone from comedy to chemicals to civics to control and now to conflict. The teacher, Solomon, generally experienced peace on every side as he reigned, but there were also issues, and we see that he actively developed Israel's arms, and beyond that, in fact, he became an arms dealer to the Hittites and the Arameans, their sworn enemies. Sometimes our government does things and we're like, why did you give a bunch of money to those people who say, by the way, we really hate you and we're going to use that money to buy weapons to destroy you? It's nothing new under the sun. Solomon gave war chariots to the Hittites and Arameans, the enemies of Israel. I'm an arms dealer. I need the money. I want to amass gold and silver for myself. So whimsy wasn't satisfying. Neither was work or weapons. How about wealth? Maybe that would be the thing. And there's an astonishing passage in the Old Testament that talks about there was so much gold in Jerusalem that silver was valueless. They're like, silver, that's not anything. They just had so much wealth under Solomon, and yet he was still empty. He was still looking for the answer. We see him like almost a mad scientist in his lab. There has to be an answer. I have all the things I ever wanted, and there he is sitting empty and heartbroken and wondering, what's it all about? Does any of this matter? Verse 8 continues, I gathered male and female singers for myself. So maybe entertainment, a waltz or a symphony or a big lavish show. Maybe he could be exhilarated by the spectacle of performing arts. But once the curtain fell, he felt the same as before. And many concubines, the delights of men. So he had tried the pleasures of the mind and pleasures of stature and pleasures of power and pleasures from the finer things of life. So he went to the pleasures of the body. Solomon, of course, we know, had 700 wives, 300 concubines. As with all of these other pursuits, he went to a further extreme than anyone else possibly could. But his heart was never bettered for it. In fact, we know specifically that this relationship with all of these different ladies were the things that eroded his heart and drew him away from the Lord. It made him worse and worse, not better and better. Verse 9 says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also remained with me. All that my eyes desired, I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. This was my reward for all my struggles. Now, these verses read quickly, right? But these were not quick projects. As an example, it took him 13 years just to build his own house, not to mention everything else. So in these short verses, he has briefly described decades of pursuits. It's a lifetime of pursuits. He did become great. I mean, by many measurements, there has never been another earthly king that was greater than Solomon, wealthier than Solomon, wiser than Solomon, more influential than Solomon, with a greater, rule than Solomon. He gave himself everything he wanted. He was a genius at everything he did. We have to understand that the teacher, Solomon, he was Howard Hughes without the insanity, and J.P. Morgan, and Jeff Bezos, and Gustav Eiffel, and Ernest Gallo of Gallo Wines. He's the billionaire that founded Gallo Wines. I learned a fun fact. Do you ever have an inkling suspicion that Hanford is like the center of the universe? Ernest Gallo lived in Hanford for the first 5 years of his life. Way to go, Hanford. Amelia Earhart, we learned recently, did some Hanford stuff too. She taught flying lessons, and there's at the Carnegie, they have some dress that was made for her. Anyway, Hanford. So Solomon is all of these people rolled into one. And he's honest about the fact that he did experience a lot of moments of pleasure. It's true. He felt the buzz. He felt the exhilaration. He felt the pride and the delights. He says here, I lived the good life. I did. All the way. More than any of you, he says. But, verse 11, when I considered all that I had accomplished and what I had labored to achieve, I found everything to be futile and a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. Considered here literally means when I faced the facts. When he was honest with himself, when he had a true assessment, when he took a look at all he had experienced. Can you imagine this moment? You're King Solomon. You've done all of this. You have spent decades doing all of this. And he's sitting there in the quiet of his heart, and he is brave enough to ask himself, does any of it matter? And the answer is no. Nothing that you did mattered on this list. Wow. And he says none of it mattered. All he could say was, I have laughed. I was buzzed. I was excited. But none of the physical pleasures or pursuits solved the need that he had. Nothing was gained. A lot was spent, but he was still empty. The experiences of pleasure or the accomplishment of great human feats cannot ultimately satisfy. They cannot give us ultimate meaning. They cannot do anything about the problem of death or the fact that your heart longs for eternity. We have such a hard time believing this to be true. Even as Christians, I think we have a hard time sometimes believing this to be true, but especially if you're not a Christian, you have a hard time believing it to be true, no matter who tries to tell us and how passionately they speak. Let me let 3 individuals speak to you that you've heard of. Jim Carrey. And I want you to know that all these quotes that you find online, none of them are true. If you're finding quotes, you students, if you're finding quotes on brainy quotes and they have no reference, they're not true, right? They're made up. That quote that you've seen, Abraham Lincoln, don't believe everything you've read on the internet. He didn't really say that. But I want you to know that I chased down the original interviews with the people. So these are real quotes that these people really said. All right, that's important to me that you know that. Let these 3 people speak to you, especially if you're not a Christian tonight. Jim Carrey. I think everybody should get rich and famous and everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that that's not the answer. Leonardo DiCaprio. I've been very lucky to have achieved a lot of the things that I dreamt of achieving as a young man, but at the end of the day, and I truly believe this, it is not about achieving great wealth or success because they don't bring happiness ultimately. They really don't. Tom Brady. Why do I have these Super Bowl rings and still think that there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. Me, I think it's got to be more than this. I mean, this can't be what it's all cracked up to be. And then the interviewer asked him, what is the answer? Brady could only say, I wish I knew, I wish I knew. Man, Tom Brady. People that all across the country, all around the world, these are individuals that like people are like, oh, I wish I could be them. And these people are saying out loud, on purpose, in print, on video, I wish I had meaning in my life. You don't want to be me because I'm missing something. I'm missing the most important piece. And I go to sleep at night wondering, is there any reason for me to be alive? All these fellows feel the same way the teacher felt, because all of them, the teacher included, made the same mistake. They forgot the spiritual component. Oh, they may say they do transcendental meditation or try out different religions or philosophies, but none of them are taking the right medicine for what ails them. It's all the wrong supplements that they're trying to take in order to solve the problem. At the start of this chapter, the teacher said, I'm looking for what is good, ultimately. Good for me, good for my life, good for my existence, good for my identity. What is good? Is this good? Is this worth living? Where can he find what is really good? He didn't find it at the end of our passage. So where could he have found it? Micah 6:8. Mankind, the Lord has told each of you what is good and what it is the Lord requires of you: to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. The answer for your life, the answer for what your heart needs, every single one of us in the room tonight, is not whimsy or work or wealth or wine or weapons or women. It's witness with God, walking with God. God who made you and loves you and called you and has put eternity in your heart so that you would seek him and find him and be in a forever relationship with him. California forever? No, thank you. We want koinonia forever, right? That's what we're looking for. Koinonia is the word that means fellowship and communion with God, your creator, your savior, your king, your friend, who says, I want to have a relationship with you, so that you can discover who I've made you to be, so that you can have life everlasting installed into your heart, so that you can have eternal value, and that the things you do matter. Now, as Christians, again, I think sometimes we tend to think we can beat the system. We'll have a relationship with God and all these other things. And sometimes we try to pursue both. We allow ourselves to put too great an emphasis on wealth or personal pleasure or finding our identity in the work that we do. But we can only have one master. There can only be one king in our hearts. We're going to love one and hate the other. We can't have it both ways. Okay, well then I guess we can't laugh anymore or have a good time. Or if we're paid well, we must not be spiritual. No, that's not the case. I remember when we would read the Little House on the Prairie books to the kids, like I think it's Paul Ingalls talks about how when he was a boy, if you laughed on the Sabbath, your dad would beat you. Oh my gosh. And they're like, hey, we're serious about our Christianity. I'm like, okay, wow. Man, and one of them like takes a sled ride on Sunday and whoo, he did it one time and not ever again, right? So it's not that Christians need to be dour and upset and never enjoy anything in life. No, what we're going to learn later in Ecclesiastes is that you are supposed to enjoy life, not just in the house of worship, but at meal times too. We'll learn that these are gifts from God, gifts that he gives us as we walk with him, that it's his delight to give us joy, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. And God does gift some believers with a great deal of earthly resources, and that's great, so that they can enjoy those resources and so that they can bless others and glorify the Lord. Listen, the Bible reveals that God wants you to laugh. He wants you to enjoy your food. He wants you to enjoy intimacy with your spouse. He wants you to work with excellence at your job and bless your efforts and do great projects in whatever life he's called you into. The question is, do we trust him enough to say to ourselves, okay, self, this is not about me, I, my pleasure, my comfort, my dreams, my ideas. This is about me walking with God, witness with him His purposes, His priority, His provision. And the Bible tells us that that is what is good. That is what fulfills. That is the answer that the teacher and Tom Brady and Jim Carrey and DiCaprio haven't discovered yet, but we have, and we get to walk in it. And so let's live with the Lord in faithfulness and service and humility and trust Him and enjoy the fullness of that witness.